Hey, good morning, Canvas family. Hope you're all doing well. Really glad that you're here with us this morning, especially if it's your first time. Let me introduce myself. My name is Travis Clark, and alongside my wife, Jenna, we get to serve as the lead pastors here at Canvas, and we're so honored that you're here. We as a church, we exist to point creatives to their creator, that they would become fully alive followers of Jesus. And so I don't know where you are in your faith. I don't know what brought you here. Maybe you're exploring your faith. Maybe you're checking Canvas out digitally before you visit us physically in person, or maybe you just found us on YouTube and you live across the world. Wherever you are, whoever you are, and whatever brought you here, we just want to say welcome and thank you so much for being a part of our community. We're excited about what's happening here in our digital space. In fact, we're releasing new content every week that you're going to want to be a part of. And the best way to do that is to hit that subscribe button. I know you heard it already, but I want to remind you one more time. Hit the subscribe button so you can get first access to all the good stuff coming out of Canvas right here on YouTube. I don't want you to miss it. So go ahead and hit subscribe. But we're continuing our series of talks here in the Canvas community on the future church. And at the heart of this teaching series is this question: what will it look like to build a future church that is worth passing on to a future generation? What will it look like to build a future church that is actually worth passing on to the future generation? Because if you're anything like me, over the last couple of years, you've looked at maybe the church and you've thought to yourself, it has to be better than this, right? Or maybe you've looked at the church and you've thought to yourself, the church must be better than this. Like, if we're going to have a church to pass on to the next generation, then we must be better than we are. And if you have felt that in any way, shape, or form, then this series is for you, because we as a church are asking ourselves, how do we build a future church here in San Francisco? And how can the church build a future church wherever you are that is actually worth passing on to the future generation? So if you've missed any of those talks, I'll go ahead and put a link right here up in the video, and you can tune in and watch those after today's gathering. We'd love to get connected with you, hear your story. So go ahead and drop us a comment right there in the video so that we can connect with you later this week. But today, I want to continue this teaching series by looking at the passion it's going to take for us to create a future church worth passing on to the future generation. During the first week, we talked a lot about the problem happening in the church, and that is over the last 20 years, the church has seen a decline in every generation from Boomer to Gen Z in regards to their engagement in the church. Like, there is a problem happening in our lifetime right now in the church. And then we talked last week about the projection of culture and technology and what that means about where people are going and how we as a church can meet them where they are. And then this week, I want to talk about the passion it's going to take from you, from me, from us, if we're going to build a future church worth passing on to a future generation. You know, just before recording this teaching, I got a phone call from a really good friend of mine. His name is Jim. And Jim's a dear friend of mine because when I was 20 years old, I was a youth pastor at a church, knew nothing. I was just so clueless. And Jim was on this team at the church I was pastoring at. And he was such a good friend to me. I just am so grateful for you, Jim, especially if you're watching right now. Jim, just know I love you, man. I mean, he's just one of the kindest, funniest people you'll meet. In fact, he's got a laugh that sounds like Count from Sesame Street. Like, that's what his laugh sounds like. It's totally contagious. It's awesome. But I love talking to Jim because he was telling me about this book that he is almost done writing. And it's full of over 100 devotionals from some of his life experiences and just lessons he's learned along the way, and how excited he is to release this book and the impact he hopes it makes in the lives of people. And the reason this is so powerful to me is because Jim also just got out of hospice care. And Jim is near the end of his life. And yet, even at the end of Jim's life, all he can think about is investing in the future generation. I mean, he could just ride off into the sunset if he wanted to. He's already lived such a good life, but he's still always thinking about the future. I respect this so much about Jim, and it reminds me a lot about what true legacy is. Sometimes I think we think legacy is about popularity or notoriety or people remembering your name or how many followers you have on social media, but that's not legacy, and I think you probably know that, right? So what is legacy? Here's the best definition I can think of. I believe legacy, true legacy, is when your life outlives your life. And Jim is living out a legacy. His legacy will continue on in my life. It'll continue on in the lives of those who read his book. I mean, Jim has lived a life of legacy. And the question is, are you? Am I? Are we? Are we living a life of legacy? Are you living a life that will outlive your life? Now, I know especially if you're like in your 20s or 30s or whatever, like you may not want to think about the end of your life. But do you know there's this passage in a book called Ecclesiastes where Solomon, who was named the wisest man to have ever lived, Solomon, he says, it's more important to attend funerals than weddings. And it's not because he's just like a buzzkill and hates parties or weddings. That's not his deal. But what he's saying is that it's so important that we remember the brevity of life. That we remember we only have a short amount of time here on this earth. And so he reminds us that it's up to us now to decide what we will do with our time. What about your life will outlive your life? And I've been thinking about this question for us as a church. What about our church right now will outlive us and will continue on to the next generation? I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the passion it will take for us to live a life that outlives our life and to build a church that will outlive us as well. See, if we're going to create a future church that's worth passing on to a future generation, we're going to have to make a decision to refuse to allow the future to leave us behind. Man, I'm convinced that if we're going to build the future, that we must refuse to wait for the future to happen, and we got to decide to happen to the future, Because you know that if you do nothing, the future will leave you in the past, and your opportunity to be a part of something greater will depart. I often think about what I would have never known if I stayed in Arizona instead of moving here to San Francisco to start Canvas. I would have never known all of you, and that alone is sad. I would have never known how God could provide when you have nothing but a vision. I would have never known the beauty of what it's like when a church becomes a family. I would have never known how awesome it is to surf or the power of an earthquake. I mean, if I stayed in Arizona, I for sure would have never known what it was like to live where your city has a winning basketball team. Come on, Golden State Warriors. This is my point. If I would have stayed where I was, I would have missed out on where I must be. And so today I want to take a look at the prophet Elisha in the Hebrew scriptures. Because Elisha was a person who refused to let the future leave him behind. Elisha was the great prophet of Israel. He was a legend. He would become known as a man of God who witnessed great miracles and was on the front lines of the power and wonder of God. And when you look, though, at the entrance of Elisha in scriptures, it's really not that exciting. In 1 Kings chapter 19, we don't see a miracle worker. We don't see a prophet. We don't see a man of God where everyone knows his name. We see Elisha, who's just a normal guy plowing a field with some oxen. Elisha was living his life behind the plow. It was monotonous. It was boring, and I can't imagine that it smelled very great being behind the behind of an ox all day long, right? But hey, it paid the bills, right? I mean, can you relate to a life that feels monotonous like that? I think there should be a holy fear that should drive us forward into the future. And that is a fear that if we stay where we are, that we very well may lose where we must be. Which is, of course, what makes Elisha's story so interesting and so relevant. Is that there came this moment in the life of Elisha where he was invited by, I guess you'd call him the OG prophet of Israel. His name was Elijah. And Elijah invited Elisha, a little confusing, he invites Elisha to be his apprentice. And this happens in 1 Kings chapter 19. And the story goes that Elisha, immediately upon getting this invitation from Elijah, he goes back to his oxen and he goes back to his plows and he kills all his oxen and then he sets his plows on fire. Which seems odd, right? Like if I accepted a new job, I wouldn't go back to my old office and burn it down. Like even if I wanted to do that, it would still be a little strange to do it. Not to mention it would also be criminal, right? But what's more important, I guess, than what Elisha did is why he did it. And why did Elisha kill his oxen and burn his plows? Because Elisha was so committed to not letting his future leave him behind that he went back to the one thing he knew so well. He went back to the thing he'd become good at. He went back to the thing that was normal, and he set it on fire. See, I wonder if the reason that this sort of sidebar part of Elisha's story is included in the story itself is because the author is trying to teach us something. And it's probably not how to properly steward farming equipment. I don't think that's the point. But I wonder if the author is giving us this moment in Elisha's life as a picture of what refusing to let the future leave you behind looks like. That if we're going to step into what we've never known, if we're going to follow the future where it's inviting us, that we're going to need to set what we've always known on fire. And so in the book of 2 Kings 2, we're told that Elisha's mentor, Elijah, he's about to be taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, and that Elijah and Elisha are on their way to another town. And Elijah, he says to Elisha in verse 1 of 2 Kings chapter 2, he says, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha, he replies, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." And so they go down to Bethel together. And at Bethel, a large group of prophets come out to Elisha and they ask Elisha, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take away your master from you today?" And Elisha, he replies, "Yes, I know, so be quiet." I love it. He's like, "Just don't talk to me about it." And then Elijah says to him, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And still Elisha, being determined to follow Elijah into the future, he says this, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." And so they both go to Jericho. And the story continues, and we're told that the company of prophets at Jericho, they come to Elisha and they ask him, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take away your master from you today?" And Elisha, probably getting a little annoyed now, he responds, "Yes, I know, so be quiet." And then Elijah says to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And Elisha replies a third time, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." And so the two of them walk on. You sort of get the suspicion that this is a test, don't you? You see, the story goes on to tell us that 50 men from this group of prophets, they stand at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha were at the Jordan. And we're told that Elijah takes his cloak, he rolls it up, he strikes the water with it, and then the water divides to the right and to the left, and the two of them cross over on dry ground. And when they crossed, Elijah then says this to Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9. He says, "Tell me what I can do before I go." Now, before we get to Elisha's request, it's really important to note that in each step along this sort of strange journey or test or whatever it is, Elisha is not the only prophet who could have been traveling with Elijah. But all the other prophets chose to stay where they were, to watch at a distance while Elijah and Elisha traveled together. And what's interesting is these prophets, obviously, they made it clear, have an idea that something is about to change. But instead of walking with Elijah into the future to see what is about to happen, they stay where they are. They watch at a distance. And it's only Elisha who again and again and again refuses to be left behind. And I don't think it's coincidental that Elijah repeatedly gives Elisha the opportunity to stay behind. Remember, it felt like a test. He even commands Elisha to stay put. I mean, no one would have thought anything less of Elisha if he would have listened to Elijah, or if he would have stopped at Bethel or remained in Jericho or never gone to the Jordan with Elijah. I mean, it would have made sense for Elisha, knowing his leader Elijah was going to go away, that the future was changing, to just go back to what he knew, to go back to the oxen, to go back to the plows, because now everything had changed. But when Elisha burned his plows, he had pre-decided how he was going to live his life. And he decided that he was going to live his life refusing to let the future leave him behind. See, it doesn't take faith to make a decision when you have all the answers. It doesn't take faith to make a decision when everything in your future is clear. You know what does take faith? To do what Elisha did and pre-decide to walk boldly into the future, even when the future isn't clear. And so when it's only Elijah and Elisha standing alone on the other side of the Jordan, Elijah then asks him this question, what can I do for you? And then Elisha responds with the most incredible of things. He says this, he says, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Now, there's no shortage of people who would ask for a double portion of what someone else had been given. Like, I think all of us would gladly accept a double portion of what somebody has that we admire. And if you don't believe me, then let me ask you this. Like, who wouldn't want a double portion of Steph Curry's ability to play basketball? Sign me up, right? I'll take a double portion of some Steph Curry, right? Who wouldn't accept a double portion of Bill Gates' income? Come on, somebody. Who wouldn't want a double portion of Steve Jobs' ability to innovate and create? Or a double portion of Einstein's intellect? Or a double portion of Adele's ability to sing, right? The issue is not that we wouldn't ever want a double portion. The issue, though, is that most want the portion without having to travel the path it takes to get there, especially if everyone else has stayed put, especially if the future is unclear, especially if normal feels so safe. But I'm convinced that Elisha would never get a double portion if he had been willing to watch Elijah walk away. See, the same is true for us. When we choose to let the future leave us behind, we will leave behind the new that God is wanting to do. And that brings us to what may be the most dramatic exit from the human story found anywhere in history. It's the exit of Elijah. And we read about it here in verses 11 through 15 in 2 Kings chapter 2. It says this, as they were walking along and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. It drove between the two men, separating them, and Elijah was carried by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha saw it and cried out, my father, I see the chariots and charioteers of Israel. And as they disappeared from sight, Elisha tore his clothes in distress. Elisha picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen when he was taken up. And then Elisha returned to the bank of the Jordan River, and he struck the water with Elijah's cloak, and he cried out, where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? And then the river divided, and Elisha went across. And when the group of prophets, remember those prophets that had been watching from a distance? From Jericho, when they saw from a distance what happened, they exclaimed, Elijah's spirit rests upon Elisha. And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. Okay, what I need you to see is that this is a story about more than what Elisha experienced. It's really a story about who Elisha was as a person. And who he was as a person was someone who refused to let the future leave him behind. And because of that, he was able to step into the new that God was bringing into his life. So let's turn the story around. And let's let this story speak to our lives today. See, the story of Elisha invites us all to ask this question, both personally and collectively. And that question is, will we settle for normal, the oxen and plows of what was, when God is actually calling us to advance into the new? Will we settle for normal, or will we advance into the new? Will we stay put in the comfort of safety? Will we, like the group of prophets, stand back and watch the future change? Or will we, like Elisha, refuse to be left behind? I found that although many will say they need clarity in order to move forward to greater things, that what we mostly need is not clarity, but what we need to step into the future is courage and conviction. And it's the same for the future church. If we wait for clarity on all things, we're going to be left behind. The future church belongs to those with the courage and conviction to keep following the future wherever it goes. The conviction that building a future church for a future generation matters, and we need the courage to do anything short of sin to build a future church worth passing on to a future generation. Like the early pioneers who began in New York and Boston with the intention of making it to San Francisco, but if you know history, you know many of them chose to settle in Oklahoma and Missouri. I fear that far too many churches have become settlers far too soon. But the future church, it won't be led by settlers. The future church will be led and shaped by pioneers. What do you think would be possible if all of us lived with such a sacred curiosity that we refuse to settle for what has always been in order to experience what we never knew was possible? What could God do in a church that lived with the spirit of a pioneer and that refused to let the future leave them behind? What could God do with a church like that? I think of like the person who shows up to a party uninvited. Have you ever known somebody who does that? On a social level, it's pretty annoying. But on a soul level, it's actually admirable, right? Like I think God is waiting for people who don't wait for the future to send them an invite before they show up. Let me close and ask you to imagine the future for a moment. Like what would happen in our church and what would happen in our city and what would happen in our own lives if we all refuse to believe the lie that God is less today than he was yesterday? Like what would happen if we said, no matter what lies ahead, no matter what it costs me, no matter what the future demands of me, no matter what change might be required, I refuse to be left behind. I refuse to just watch the future at a distance. I'm going to commit to walk with the future each and every step of the way. Like what could be possible? I've been thinking about this psalm in Psalm 145, verse 4. It says, let each generation tell its children of your mighty acts. Let them proclaim your power. I've been wrestling with how to end this talk, but this verse keeps coming back to my mind. And every time I read it, I feel like God is asking me, and maybe he's asking you, what kind of stories will the future generation tell about us? Will the future generation tell stories of our faith and of our courage, how we refuse to accept normal or the status quo? Or will they tell stories of our safety and our fear? Will the next generation thank us for the church that we gave them? Will the future generation see the church that we gave them as a ceiling that keeps their faith from rising? Or will they see the church that we gave them as a floor that the next generation can build their faith upon? See, I don't want to wait to see the future happen. I want to build that future now in the present. And I want to give the next generation a beautiful church to be a part of, and an even more beautiful story to tell. Let's pray. Father God, I just thank you so much for my brothers and sisters watching right now. God, I pray that we as one community, that we would not wait for clarity, but we would live with courage and conviction. I pray that we wouldn't wait for the future to happen, but that we would happen to the future. That we would commit right now in this very moment to refuse to be left behind, to refuse to be left behind in that which was, or that which is normal, or that which is safe, or that which is easily understood, that we would commit ourselves now to walk into the future, to see what it is that you are doing in your church, so that we can build a future church that is worth passing on to the future generation. Father God, I pray that right now in this very moment, you would give us a burden for the future, a vision for the future, and courage to begin stepping into that future. We love you so much, and we ask this in the name of Jesus.